If you don't understand this, it's impossible for you to understand all the major events that's happening in the world today. And I do think many people, many individuals, many groups are extremely confused about what's happening in the world today precisely because they have a wrong understanding of what China is. So yes, the point of this discussion is to help raise the level of understanding of everyone here, and hopefully we can take this into the branches and discuss with the comrades. Because yeah, this is one of the defining features of our epoch, is the rise of China. So yes, China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. It's actually the oldest continuous civilization in the world. It's over 5,000 years old. Made many advances in technology, the development of the productivity of labor. For a long time, China was actually far in advance of Europe, far in advance in terms of development. On the basis of major developments in agriculture and other things, you had this massive population. And for a long time, China's been the most populous country on the face of the planet up until very recently when India has overtaken China. But, you know, all things being equal, China should be one of the main dominant powers in the world. It should be. Left to its own, it would be. But things are very rarely equal, and no country is left to its own. Smaller European countries, especially since you had the rise of capitalism. So you've had these smaller European countries, smaller populations, Britain, France, etc., that developed capitalism, which Marx described, massively revolutionized the productive forces, and then they developed a colonial policy towards other countries like China. And it's been the policy of Western imperialism for a long time to keep China down. There was the Dutch, the British, the French, then the Americans that have been trying to keep China down to stop China from rising, because I think they know that this could be very easily a major rival. So the question that we have to answer today is, how did China go from a subservient, dominated nation to essentially what is a world superpower today that is actually exploiting and dominated other countries? Now, one thing to begin with, some people say that if we admit that China is an imperialist power, we're contradicting the theory of the permanent revolution. I would say that is not at all true. In fact, the development of China confirms the theory of the permanent revolution. The theory of the permanent revolution states that in a backwards country dominated by imperialism, the bourgeoisie cannot play a progressive role. They cannot actually develop the nation. They cannot complete the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution. And actually, the bourgeoisie in China did not complete these tasks. These tasks, many of them were completed. They have been completed. You have had national unification in China. You have sovereignty in China. They expelled the imperialists. They abolished landlordism. And these tasks were completed. You know, some people think, oh, so that means you're saying that, you know, the permanent revolution is wrong. We're not saying the permanent revolution was wrong, because it was not the bourgeoisie that completed these tasks. It was not the bourgeoisie that threw off the yoke of imperialism, that catapulted China out of backwardsness and its state of domination. It was the Chinese Revolution of 1949, which from a Marxist point of view is the second most important event in human history, that achieved agrarian reform, national unification, sovereignty, etc. And this is the fundamental thing to understand. It was on this basis that China has been able to achieve the position it has today. And by the 1990s, we'll get into this, by the 1990s when China started to, I would say, more consciously transition towards capitalism, it was not a backwards, divided, dominated country. It was actually a significant power of sorts and a unified country that was not dominated by imperialism, that had a very strong state, a high level of education and culture, etc. China with the revolution, Mao came to power, was not modeled off of the Russian Revolution of 1917. It was modeled off of Stalin's Russia. There was no workers' democracy. And actually, because of this, China was not a degenerated, I've heard some comments say, oh, it's like a degenerated workers. No, it wasn't. It was a deformed worker state right from the beginning, which gave certain characteristics to it. I think the pro-capitalist tendencies were stronger earlier on, and there was a high degree of dislocation earlier on because there was no workers' democracy. There was no way for the workers actually discussing the way forward. It was decided by a bureaucracy right at the beginning. Trotsky described that the bureaucracy was not a class. This was not a class. Some groups say that China's state capitalist. We think that it was not state capitalist after the revolution. The bureaucracy was not a class, but a parasitic growth on the planned economy, basically glorified managers. They defended, and they did defend the planned economy. They defended the planned economy, but above all else, they defended their privileges. And insofar as they defended their privileges, they defended the planned economy because their privileges derived from the planned economy, albeit in a distorted way. And so we have to get it through. We have to understand that the bureaucracy was not a socially necessary layer. The planned economy actually worked in spite of them, and actually with great difficulties, with massive dislocations because of the bureaucratic mismanagement. As Trotsky said, socialism needs democracy like the body needs oxygen. So the fact of the matter, especially after the economy gets more complicated, it can't be planned by a tiny bureaucracy. So this actually ends up being a fundamental contradiction in any deformed worker state. In any deformed worker state, you have this problem where they have a planned economy, they're trying to advance forward, but the bureaucracy is stifling that development. It's sucking up a greater portion of the surplus being created, but it's also stifling the development of the economy because it can't be planned in this way. So you have this, and then you have debates within the bureaucracy of what way forward. And inevitably, one wing starts contemplating, not necessarily consciously going back to capitalism, but using market mechanisms. So, yeah, Mao's Great Leap Forward failed. Because of this, it was a bureaucratic mismanagement. Lots of people died. It caused big dislocation. And the wing that was more moving, that wanted to move in the direction of using market measures, was associated with Deng Xiaoping, gained a bit more power. Mao was kind of he was still there, but he wasn't the main guy. In response to this, there was a fight in the bureaucracy. Mao launched the Cultural Revolution against Deng. And now a lot of people glorified this, said this is like the Paris Commune, this is amazing or something. But really what you had here is a fight between two wings of the bureaucracy. You had the Maoist wing that just wanted to keep doing what they were doing regardless of the consequences. And you had the Deng wing that was they were looking for a way out of the mess. Not a good way, but they were looking for a way out. So Mao, launched the Cultural Revolution to fight against the capitalist roaders, as he called them. Deng was sidelined. He was taken off the Central Committee. But the economy still had all the problems. So Mao just kept trying to do, he was a voluntarist. He believed you could just keep doing what we can force it, we can do what we want, But there was no way that you can get around the fundamental problems of the planned economy with a bureaucracy, right? All these issues in a backwards, what had been a very backwards economy is still very backwards at the time. The Deng wing, probably at this time, the decisive majority of the bureaucracy agreed with Deng Xiaoping, but they were scared. If you read what happened in the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't very nice. So they probably agreed with him, but they were waiting. So, yes, but of course the bureaucracy is not going to reform itself out of existence and implement workers' democracy, which would have been the solution to the problem, so that all of the issues the economy could be planned rationally, and there could be checks and balances by the workers on all of the bureaucratic dislocations, but they're not going to do that. Trotsky described how the bureaucracy is never going to renounce its control and power, right? That's why we called for a political revolution against the bureaucracy. So Trotsky he was talking about the Soviet Union, but I think a lot of this applies to China. Trotsky raised different possibilities. He obviously was fighting for the workers to overthrow the bureaucracy, establish workers' democracy. But then he said a second possibility, he said that might not happen. Second possibility, that there's a pro-capitalist party that comes to power and overthrows the bureaucracy, returns to capitalism. This is more or less what happened in the Soviet Union, actually, in a different way, but more or less. Now, but neither of these happened in China. So Trotsky actually says he wasn't just rigid in what he was saying. He was saying there could be a third variant. He said that neither a revolutionary or a counter-revolutionary party seizes power. The bureaucracy continues at the head of the state. He said, even under these conditions, social relations will not gel. We cannot count upon the bureaucracy peacefully and voluntarily renouncing itself on behalf of socialist equality. If at the present time it has considered it possible to introduce rank and decorations, it must inevitably, in the future stages, seek supports for itself in property relations. So he was playing with the idea that even the bureaucracy would start using market measures to seek supports for itself, right? So yeah, and this is ultimately what starts to begin to happen in China. Mao dies in 1976. What is known as the Gang of Four, that was basically Mao's wife, the hardline Maoists, they're the ones that didn't want to open up to the market, they want to just keep going. They're arrested. Deng comes to power in 1978. He begins using market mechanisms to achieve an increase in productivity to deal with the problems that the Chinese economy was facing. Like I said, the bureaucracy was like a straitjacket. There was all these problems. Deng called it market socialism. He says this is a brilliant analysis here. He says, if markets serve socialism, they are socialist. If they serve capitalism, they are capitalist. Well, solve the problem then, I guess. At this point, it's clear that they're not consciously, even Deng's not consciously saying, hey, we're going to introduce capitalism. I mean, I'm not inside his head, but I think it's pretty clear he didn't want to move totally to capitalism. But these things have a logic of their own. 1979, they introduced these special economic zones on the southern coast, Hong Kong, Macau, Guangdong, Fujian provinces. And these are zones that would be open to foreign investment. Initially, there was tight restrictions on this. They had a lot of restrictions about what you could and could not do, how many workers could work in these fields, et cetera, et cetera. And the bureaucracy was moving, related to the first discussion we had yesterday, totally empirically. They were just like, well, we have a problem. What are we going to do? What Mao was doing didn't work. Okay, so we should open up to the market, right? So we open up the market. Soviet Union right now is stagnating. So like that's a problem with this model. Maybe we need to look at what's happening in the West. Maybe we could do something with the market, right? Open up to foreign investment. You know, Lenin did that with the new economic policy. Let's just do that. Needed to attract foreign investment. But the problem here is there's too many restrictions. They had to open up more. It has a logic of its own. They had to, okay, it's not working. The special economic zones didn't really work that well at the beginning. So there ended up being a discussion, well, maybe we need to open it up a bit more, make it easier for them to profit, right? This is what happens when you start introducing capitalism. And the market starts to direct the process. Even at this day, they thought the state's directing the market, but you can quite clearly see here that the state isn't directing the market. The market's starting to direct the state. You start largely with agriculture. The collectivized land system is dismantled. Private production is introduced. There's differentiation within the rural population, whereas before there wasn't. Some start to become very rich. You start to have basically what you describe as kulaks. And others are forced to migrate to the cities for work. And this is important because what does capitalism need? Capitalism needs free wage labor. So you're liberating these people, kicking them off the land, basically, and forcing them to go into the cities to work for the bourgeoisie, actually, eventually, whether it's a foreign company or a Chinese. This is actually a similar process, similar we saw in Britain with the, although on a vaster scale. This is probably the biggest process like this we've ever seen. It's similar to what you saw in Britain with the enclosures, you know, the kicking the peasants off the land, the freeing the labor up for exploitation by the bourgeoisie. This is a prerequisite for capitalism, capitalist development. Is really, and like I said, this is really an unprecedented in scope and speed of this process. It had happened in a few decades, ultimately. So yeah, they began attracting foreign capital. They introduced more pro-capitalist laws. They used to have lifetime jobs at the state-owned enterprises. They eliminated that. Workers could be fired. That's nice. Yeah. Private workforce began to grow. In 1979, there was only 250,000 people that worked for private companies. Just a few years later, there's a few million, which is still a small fraction of the Chinese population, but you see it's starting to take off. And at this stage, it's important to note, it's not as though Tesla, or obviously Tesla came in, or like big companies came in and were just hiring a whole bunch of, no, it was mostly small. Actually, I've seen people use this, say, oh no, but it's just in small companies, to say capitalism's not being reintroduced. There were initially limits on how many workers private companies could hire. And in 1980, the state sector was still dominant. 70% of the economy was the state sector. At this point, I would say it's still a deformed worker state. They were using capitalist methods to try to develop the economy. In 1984, prices in agricultural and consumer goods is liberalized. They used to have state controls on prices. Those are eliminated. Basically, now the market's starting to decide prices more directly. 1984, they have the 12th Congress of the Party. They come up with all these very contradictory terms. This one is like the planned commodity economy. It's like you can see here. There's a contradiction that it ends up being resolved. I believe it has been resolved now. They add 14 more cities to the special economic zone. So you see this slow creeping capitalism in the system. All of China's coastline is added. Very important thing. We're in the 1980s. Very important process starts beginning. That the USSR is slowing down. There are massive problems in the USSR. Obviously, the Chinese bureaucracy is seeing this. The USSR starts to collapse. You have 1989, 1991. You have the USSR is done. You also have similar problems in China. You had Tiananmen events in 1989. So obviously the bureaucracy is looking at this. They're probably like, whew, we didn't get overthrown. We need to do something. Otherwise, we're going to be done, you know? Really bad things can happen. They saw what happened to the Soviet Union. GDP collapsed. It was horrible. The 90s were absolutely horrible in the ex-Soviet countries. So they obviously did not want to go down that road. They decided at this point, still, I'd say it's still a deformed worker state largely. They're just using a little bit of market, right? A little bit of like that. Now, obviously, there starts to be this idea that we need to massively accelerate this process. Otherwise, we're going to get this exact same problem that their counterparts in the Soviet Union had. So, yes, 1992, they adopt the idea that, or they abandon the idea. They always had, up until now, they had the idea that the state sector must predominate, right? They abandon that idea. They say, that's just a formality, right? It's not that important. So basically, I believe at this point, they're deciding that they're going to transition back to capitalism. They've decided that so-called socialism doesn't work. We've seen it fail. And that if we want to save our skins, we got to transition. Again, I'm not in their heads. It seems like this is exactly what. At some level, there is this thought. But they have to do it in a controlled manner so that they can guarantee their positions, their safety, and actually become bourgeois themselves. Deng goes to Shenzhen Special Economic Zone and makes a speech. And instead of this idea that he's been preaching for a while, that we're using markets to help to build socialism, he basically goes very Bukharin-esque and says, as long as it makes money, it's good for China. So it's sort of get rich, the get rich moment. 1993, there are 2,000 special economic zones. 1994, they privatized 2,500 locally state-run companies and 100 of the big centrally run state-owned companies. They have this idea would just maintain state control over the top 100 enterprises. And this is actually very similar to something, this process that I'm describing here is very similar to something that Trotsky talks about, what would happen if the bureaucracy started to move back to capitalism. He talks about the revolution betrayed. He said, the chief task of the new power would be to restore private property in the means of production. First of all, it would be necessary to create conditions for the development of strong farmers from the weak collective farms. And as I said, it started with agriculture. And for converting the strong collectives into producers, cooperatives of the bourgeois type, into agricultural stock companies. This is actually precisely what you see. They start to have these things. I think it's confusing for people because they'd have these small collectives that are operating on a profit model. They're different than the previous model, and it's based on efficiency, and you can fire workers and stuff like this. It's not entirely private, but it's moving in that direction, right? So there's kind of a transition here. The planning principle, this is Trotsky, and the planning principle would be converted for the transitional period into a series of compromises between state power and individual corporations, potential proprietors, that is, among the Soviet captains of industry, the émigré former proprietors and foreign capitalists. Yes, so this is what he's basically describing, sort of how it's not as though you have this process that's everything's privatized immediately overnight. You can have this transition into it. So yes, one question I want to deal with is the foreign investment, foreign capital in China. Yes, so by the end of the 1990s, you start to have all this process of opening up more special economic zones, more privatization, more labor freedom, liberalization, et cetera, and it starts to have an effect. Well, as the early special economic zones, there wasn't, like if you're a private company, you're like, fuck, I don't want to have to deal with these communist assholes. Like, I have to invest here, and they're controlling what I can do, how many you can hire, how much money I can make, different rules and regulations. I don't want to do that. But now it's like, this is pretty good. You have this fucking dictatorship. You don't have free trade unions. They just crush everybody, and they allow this massive pool of educated, cheap labor that I can use. So you start to have massive investment. By the end of the 90s, 450 out of the top 500 corporations in the world all operate in China. This is this process in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union of globalization. China, the integration of China, you had a slow integration of China into the world market. And really what this is at this stage is China is, for the imperialists, this is a big, cheap pool of labor. I think wages in the 90s are 26 American dollars a month. It actually was it was a very important thing that kept inflation down in the West. Because you take jobs out of here, you put them over there, you produce cheap trinkets. Largely they're producing textiles, toys, cheap electronics in China. Actually, you know this thing that people quite often talk about, cheap Chinese product. That's a boomer take from the 90s, because it was true. It was largely cheap crap, right? It's not true anymore. It's not true anymore, actually. We'll talk about that in a bit. So at this point, I would say China definitely is not imperialist. It's not an imperialist country. It's actually in some ways being exploited by imperialism. But we look at the big picture. There's a bigger process at work here. The so-called Communist Party of China is in control of the process. The state is a massive, powerful state apparatus, and they're managing this. They maintain heavy state involvement to guide the process, to protect the system in China, to protect the developing Chinese bourgeoisie, which at this point is developing, and also not just to protect them from foreign imperialism, to protect the system as a whole from crisis. For example, and actually China, some people have pointed to this, China hasn't had you'll have these big crises in the West, and China seems maybe go down a bit, but it's not as affected. And the state does play a role in guiding the process to basically try to make sure that they're not affected. Like, for example, the Southeast Asian Stock Exchanges crashed in 1997, and China was largely unaffected by this because the state was so heavily involved. This is, by the way, starting to change. You can see this. So yeah, state ownership. By the early 2000s, state ownership now is down to 34%. But again, I think it's important. It's not a simple formula. It's not like, you're under 50%, you're capitalist, therefore. Although I do think that this is decisive. It is a decisive fact. But it isn't a simple formula. It's more important, it's as Trotsky talks about, he says, it's more important how the state is functioning and with what aim. And look at the overall direction of the process. And I think it's very clear when you look at the general process what the direction is. So what as Trotsky says, he says, the class nature of the state is consequently determined not only by its political forms, but by its social content, i.e., by the character of the forms of property and productive relations which the given state guards and defends. I think it's clear what they are guarding and defending at this moment. Yes, so I think by the end of the 90s, it had already become clear that the bureaucracy was clearly convinced that private companies were just way more efficient. They could see that. And that the state-owned enterprises, which there are many still today, some of the top companies in the world are Chinese state-owned enterprises, but they only exist to support the development of the private sector, the development of Chinese capitalism, and actually shield them and nurture the bourgeoisie. At this point in the late 90s, early 2000s, they hadn't developed a bourgeoisie capable of running major corporations and competing with them at the world scale, like the Americans, the Europeans, the Canadians, etc. Big turning point. 2002, China joins the World Trade Organization. In order to do that, they abandoned the idea, they abandoned the state monopoly on foreign trade. This is of fundamental importance. Actually, Trotsky says this is like a line you do not cross, basically. Because, as he said, it's like the cheap commodities from the imperialists are actually more of a threat than the arms, you know? So this is a runaway process that's gathering speed. At this point, you start to see that the next 20 years here, up until the current point, is really quite amazing. I think China still in the early 2000s was still largely a low-wage, cheap commodity economy. And then you have 20 years, I think it's almost unparalleled, the rise of China, the rise of Chinese imperialism. So I believe at this point, you could already say China's capitalist at some point here. When is not actually as important. So you start to see this runaway process, incredible growth, the development of massive corporations, Chinese corporations actually, hundreds of billionaires. Actually, China, I just looked at it the other day. I thought China had less billionaires than America, but Enrique corrected me. China currently has like 830 billionaires, and America has 700 and something billionaires. Now, China has 5 times as many people or something like that, so obviously, it's not equal, but this is quite amazing. This is quite amazing. In 2011, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce stated openly, after 30 years of reform and opening up, China has completed the transformation from a planned economy to a market economy. Right from the horse's mouth. We can just accept their words. So the transition to imperialism, though, it's interesting. So, like I said, China was a low-wage economy, was producing cheap things that you'd buy at Dollarama, probably, or whatever, in the West. But this starts to change. And it starts to not simply be a cheap source of labor for foreign capital. The state is intentionally nurturing a Chinese bourgeoisie. How do they do this? Well, and actually you can see, sometimes Western imperialist politicians complain about the Chinese spying and they're stealing our secrets. There is an element of truth. They sent thousands of students to Western universities that studied, worked in companies, and learned how the latest tricks of the trade in all various fields. They targeted specific fields as well. They targeted AI, like electronic vehicles, space. There's people sharing online how they sent a rocket into space, and Elon Musk is salty about it. But they targeted high-tech fields that they could see that was going to be the future. They intentionally targeted them. They stole technology from the West. They stole technology from the West, or the knowledge, and they applied it in China. Yes. So, and I can get in a bit more details about that, but the fact of the matter is, it's no longer the dominant feature that China is a cheap, low-wage economy. It's a high-tech, high-wage economy, actually. For example, the average urban wage, and most people in China, there's a bit of inequality here because of the rural question, but the fact is, like, over 60% of people live in big cities in China. So I'll use the urban wage. The average urban wage in China is $2,200 US a month. Huh? Yeah, it's more than I make. More than a full-timer makes. China! So the average wage in Canada is $5,400. So obviously Canada makes more. In the US, it's $6,200 a month. So obviously far in advance of the average Chinese wage, but more importantly is as I said, the average Chinese wage per month in the 90s was $26. That means the wages increased nearly 1,000 times in the last 30 years. Now, Canada and the US, you might say, oh, but the wages in Canada and the US have also increased. Yeah, they've doubled in the last 30 years approximately, which actually means nothing when you factor in inflation. So what you've seen is a massive increase in wages. How does that make sense? So China has been catching up. It's related to this is all about the nature of the economy. They have advanced technologies, and in some sectors, China is ahead, is actually the leading country in some fields. I mentioned electric vehicles, electric vehicle batteries. For example, there's this Chinese company, Contemporary Amperex Technology Limited, 38% of the market share. They're the leader in producing electric batteries, the largest. They supply all major EV producers, including Tesla, Ford, Volvo, who, by the way, I don't know if you know that, Volvo is not a Swedish company. It's owned by a Chinese billionaire. They've been buying up a lot of companies like this. What is this? Is it socialism? This doesn't look like socialism to me. How have they achieved this? So yes, they use the state to hold back imperialism, tight control. The bureaucrats managed this. They invited foreign capital. They stole technology. They sent, as I mentioned, they sent thousands of students to Western universities to learn. They invested hundreds of billions in research and development in targeted areas so they could outcompete the West. Yeah, I think one fact here that's important is also combined and uneven development. That a formerly backwards economy can actually leap ahead and outstrip certain more developed ones. Like, for example, how America did this when they overtook the UK. Because the UK was, and this happens when you have a big power that's been the main dominant power for a long time, there's a certain conservatism that sets in, a certain complacency, and actually it's related to the fact that your economy is so heavily invested in certain industries that when you need to revolutionize or move on, there's resistance from the old guard. For example, China did not have a traditional car industry, like gas guzzlers. Didn't have that. So for them to go to EVs was easy. They didn't have the resistance like they have had in the West. So they moved to EVs very quickly, very easily actually. And they overtook America in fairly short order. BYD being the leading electric vehicle producer in the world. So yes. So I believe China's role in the world has changed. It's an imperialist power in its own right. Now, what is imperialism? So just a basic definition from Lenin. Some people think, I've heard this from so many fucking people, but China doesn't use military power. They don't do coups in other countries, so therefore they're not imperialist. This is a factor of imperialist. That can be a form in the way that imperialist domination is ascertained, but I believe that's not the content of imperialism itself. So yeah, we just got to go back to Lenin. Imperialism is one, concentration of production and capital developed to such a high stage that it creates monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. 2, merging of banking and industrial capital to create finance capital. 3, export of capital distinguished from the export of commodities. 4, formation of international monopolies, capitalist associations which share the world amongst themselves. Territorial division of the world amongst the big capitalist powers becomes complete. He's talking about the dawning of the imperialist stage, right? This is what Lenin described in imperialism. He's clearly referring not just to one country. He's referring to a world system, right? And he's not defining it simply by ticking boxes. I believe, even if you do the box ticking exercise, China fulfills all of these very clearly. I don't know how you would deny anyone. It is now part and actually a major player in the world imperialist system. China is dominated by big monopolies. Huge companies dominate large percentage of the Chinese economy. and the world. For example, in the Forbes 500, I just looked it up last year, 128 of those top 500 companies in the world are Chinese. 139 are US. This has been the case for some time, that China has been rising and challenging the US's dominance. The question of finance capital. Finance capital dominates China. There's been a fusion of banking and industrial capital. For example, the 4 largest banks in the world by assets are Chinese. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the Chinese Construction Bank, the Agricultural Bank of China, and the Bank of China are the 4 largest banks in the world. They're bigger than JP Morgan. And they play a huge role in the Chinese economy and a big role in the world. These are the banks that China uses to finance new projects, right? This is connected to the other point. They're not simply exporting cheap commodities. They're exporting capital. So foreign direct, some bourgeois categories aren't entirely accurate, but we'll use them because I think they give you a picture anyway. For example, foreign direct investment outward stock in 2002 was 36 billion in China, meaning the amount of money that their Chinese companies and state companies and private companies are investing outside of China, 36 billion, which is actually, in the grand scheme of things, not very much. By 2022, it was up to 3 trillion. You can see this expanded over 100 times. This is quite incredible. The US, in the same period of time, went from 2 trillion to 8 trillion. So you can see the US outwards foreign direct investment stock increased 4 times, Chinese 100 times. Also, one other thing, I don't know why they do, well, I kind of know why, but they count Hong Kong separately. And Hong Kong was more advanced than China, and that it went, in 2002, they had 370 billion, and in 2022, they went up to 2 trillion. So actually, basically what you have is US 8 trillion, China 5 trillion. So they're rivaling America. Also, the arrow, the direction that it's headed. You can see the massive expansion. And what effect does this have on world relations? Well, how does this manifest itself? The question, division of the world between the major powers. That's another one of the things that Lenin talks about. You probably heard of the Road Belt Initiative, the so-called Silk Road or whatever, the new Silk Road. What is this? This is shipping. They're securing shipping lanes and trading routes around the world, and sources of energy and raw materials, and securing fields of investment. And in the process of this, they're chaining a whole number of countries to them through the export of capital and investment, capital investment. And this has led them directly into a conflict with the United States, which can only be understood as an imperialist conflict. Try to invent another term to describe it, doesn't help you, just leads to more confusion. We've seen the increasing tensions, just to name a few with Canada. We saw the whole thing with the 2 Michaels, the spies, or the non-spy spies, you know. They were Canadian spies spying on China. They were arrested. Canada arrested the CEO of Huawei, which is, why did they do that? They say, oh, because the phones and they're spying and stuff. Then don't buy their phone, man, whatever. Like, is it a free market or not? No, it's because Huawei actually is a major player and it's rivaling in 5G networks. And they don't want that because they got AT&T and they got these other ones, right? In every industry, and whenever you see a political conflict or something like that happens, look at the economics behind it, and it's very clear. It's a Chinese company and an American or European company, and they're intervening to protect their bourgeoisie. You saw this with electric vehicles. Biden's electric vehicle tariff, Canada followed suit, for example. The conflict over Panama Canal. So C.K. Hutchinson, which is a major Hong Kong-based private company, was forced to sell 2 Panama ports to a U.S.-led consortium, which involves BlackRock. Why? Why did they do that? It's the pushback against this Belt and Road Initiative. They don't want China using that. Now, in the 90s, just a side point, in the 90s it became fashionable. I remember this, many people here won't, but it became fashionable for Western so-called Marxian academics to argue that there was no imperialism in the Leninist sense, but that instead you had empire. It's connected to what George Bush Sr. talked about, New World Order, and the U.S. was dominating, and everyone got confused. There was people like Hart and Negri, like Marxian academics, described this, that there was this empire thing. It kind of closely approximated Kautsky's idea of ultra-imperialism. Now, I think, looking back, this has been conclusively, I'm mentioning this because this has been conclusively proven to be absolute nonsense, totally false. All we had is one particular period of time where there was one dominant imperialist power that was forcing itself on the world, or attempting to. The neocons became cocky. We talked about that yesterday. But that was impossible to maintain forever. And in the words of great theoretician Marco Rubio, he said, "It's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually, you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multi-great powers in different parts of the planet." And so this is what we're talking about, how the Trump people are basically recognizing this basic reality. And this is essentially what you have. You have various imperialist powers, and they're all defending the interests of their own bourgeoisie around the world. So on the question of military power, because I mentioned it, yeah, China not using military power to secure its interest. Some argue, therefore, China is not imperialist. China is nice. It's benevolent. That's socialism, isn't it? So this actually doesn't mean that China is not imperialist at all, as I've already talked about. Actually, they're not using military force for various reasons. One, I think they can't in most instances, and it also would be very, very stupid for them to do that. And also, they don't need to. They are offering better deals. Also, most countries fucking hate America for what they've been doing. It's as, what's his name, Lavrov, minister in Putin, I think he's foreign minister, I can't remember. He said the U.S. is agreement incapable. Is that they don't trust them. Why would you make a deal with these bastards? Look what they're doing, you know? And so, yes, they don't need to use that. But it doesn't mean that they won't. They've already established some military bases. Mainly, they built a military base in Djibouti, which, if you know your geography, that's actually at a very important choke point. Very important. So there's lots of ports that they're building all around the world, which could be used for military purposes. We don't know. But this is kind of beside the point. They are massively expanding their military power. They're still they're still dwarfed by America. That is true. But they're preparing. They do understand. And can you really blame them? Why wouldn't you? You got what's happening with NATO and with the whole history, right? But yeah, what's the pattern? Some might say, oh, but this doesn't prove that China is imperialist. Okay, let's go. Here's the classic pattern of what happens. Chinese state-owned bank lends money to a country. In exchange for what? Access to resources and preferential trade. This is known as resources-backed lending. There's a double benefit for China here. It's like I'm quoting Lenin's imperialism, is it not? This is exactly what's up. China gets access to resources, and then the country uses the loan to build infrastructure. Infrastructure. All right, Mark Carney likes saying that. And they build a project, and who does the project? A Chinese company. And then the Chinese company then, oh, well, we don't know how to operate the project. Who can operate it? Well, we got smart people. We can operate it. Cool. Well, so they're basically borrowing money to pay a Chinese company to build it and operate the project. And what types of projects? Railways that go to a mine that help the China get resources. This is essentially what is happening all over Africa and in many parts of the world. Yeah, even electric dams. Oh, they helped them build an electric dam. Yeah, because they needed to power their mine, basically. You know? They'll do a deal. You know, you can use some to, I guess you can kind of power some poor people over there, but we're going to use it, you know? And fairly often, countries, actually lately, the past few years, a lot of countries have been defaulting. Then what happens? China goes, well, yoink, that's ours. It's like when you default on your mortgage, right? Now we own it. And they use the debt as political leverage in some instances. What is this relationship, if not an imperialist relationship? They're enchaining countries to them economically. And at a certain stage, this will be backed up by some form of military might. Maybe not immediately, but at some point it would have to be. So yes, and the speed at which this is happening is really astounding. Everywhere, all over Africa, Latin America, Asia. Ports is another major one. China operates or has ownership in 91 major ports around the world, port projects. They basically have a foothold in every single continent except for Antarctica, which, yeah, it's not a major trading place. Yes, this is them securing shipping and trading routes. This is the behavior of a classic imperialist nation who wants to secure its trading interests, resource access, etc. This is openly recognized by every major U.S. politician, by every major U.S. think tank. They've all been talking about this for a while now, trying to figure out what to do. For example, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, this is a key think tank in the U.S. Kissinger used to work for them. This is what they say. China's position in control and influence over the majority of port infrastructure globally poses a significant economic and military security threat to the United States. Simply put, China could use its power to interfere with operations that rely on port access, including military and economic operations, and are vital to U.S. interests. So yeah, this is what they're saying. Gonna have to move on. Yes, sorry. So will China overtake America? I've heard this, people think. So therefore, China's going to be the big power then, and America's going to lose. No. I think we're saying no, actually. There is limits to this process, and I believe the Chinese economy has sort of more or less reached a lot of those limits. They're facing a classic crisis of overproduction. This is part of the reason for the trade war. The companies complaining about China dumping, meaning they're trying to sell their products. Now, they don't want them to sell their products. If China can't sell its products to the Europe or Canada or America, they'll have a fucking massive crisis, right? And you're starting to see this. The economy is slowing. This year, their growth rate will be the slowest it's been, in decades. 4.5%, which is still obviously much over the West, but it's slowing. Also, one other factor, the rate of profit is also falling, because when China was coming from such a low level, it could grow very quick. Productivity of labor could make huge leap forwards. You take someone, a peasant, working in the countryside, using backwards methods, and you put them in a modern factory, his productivity of labor has gone up hugely. This is not the same anymore. The same investment of capital does not produce the same leap forward in the rate of profit. So GDP growth has slowed, rate of profit slowed down, as we've seen with the trade war, Chinese and U.S. economies are highly integrated. That it's really difficult for them to disentangle this. China, there's sort of limits to them overtaking the United States. And the U.S. has declined, but it's still, this decline is relative. It's still by far the biggest economy. If you look at it this way, like the Chinese population is like 5 times that of America. So even when you quote this figure, Chinese economy is like 20% of GDP, Americans like 26, they're almost equal. It's like, but the productivity of labor per worker is still massively higher in America, if you look at it that way, or the profit per worker, if you want to put it that way, in any measure. So yes, we shouldn't overplay that. One thing I want to add, I was reading about this recently. Inside China, there are massive problems. Last year, it's related to what I was saying, the slowdown. There's this Mandarin word, Nezhuan, that went viral last year. It basically means rolling something inside, like it's sort of like tightening something. So it more or less, people are using it because it went viral. Julian, you'll find this funny, because there was a video of this guy riding on his laptop while he was riding his bike. I'm saying that because Julian likes to read and walk at the same time. Stakhanovite tradition, you know. But yeah, this is a thing in China, is people are like, there's such an intensification of labor taking place that this guy was on his laptop working as he was riding his bike, probably to work. And so this went viral in China. And this word Nezhuan basically means, I basically say the literal translation is rolling inside, but I would say it means like rat race, basically. And so this is very common. People see, it's like that they're not getting the same result. They're not getting ahead. Like there was people, I've met people over the last 20 years that, like Chinese students that were talking about, fuck communism, man, capitalism's amazing. Look at the wages. Everything's awesome. And people are largely realizing, wait, man, this process has ran its course. We've tightened enough. We can't get out of it. So yeah, there are huge contradictions inside China, and there are limits to the growth and profitability that they have. So yes, what's the position of communists? Obviously, this is not a China bashing leadoff. The main enemy is at home. The main enemy is not of communists in Canada is not China. The allies, our allies, are the workers of the world. The allies are the workers of China, who are complaining about Neijuan. The capitalist development in China has created a powerful working class, and there are no reformist traditions in the working class movement like you have in the West. That's so fucking annoying. You know, you have to deal with it all the time. But there are no reformist unionist trade union traditions. There's a fresh working class that's largely moved out of the countryside fairly recently. History has known this parallel a whole bunch of times. Russia is probably the main one. Fresh working class, young, that advances and then gets stuck and gets fucking angry and rises up. So we can predict similar events. Similar conditions produce similar events. Yes. And this whole process will have of slowing down the promise of this sort of, I don't even know, it's really like they're promised a dream, you know, like an American dream type situation. And it certainly seemed like it was delivering, but the fact that it's not delivering the goods, or increasingly not delivering the goods, will create massive repercussions inside China, which is preparing revolutionary explosions. And yes, we're building the Revolutionary Communist International. We fight for international world revolution. We have no stake in the fight between imperialist powers, but we're fighting for an international revolution of the working class. We must link up with the working class in China and fight together to overthrow imperialism. Leave it at that.